The Collapsing Thunder. Part 1. Two Worlds of Terror. In the vast tapestry of cinema, two worlds exist that couldn't be more different, yet both pulse with an underlying dread that seeps into your bones as you drift toward sleep. Close your eyes and imagine the first world, a dystopian near-future Australia, teetering on the brink of total collapse. This is the Mad Max world, where society clings to its final threads along desolate highways that stretch endlessly through barren, dusty outback roads. The landscape is unforgiving, empty highways cutting through wasteland, with small isolated towns dotting the expanse like forgotten outposts of a dying civilization. In this crumbling world, fuel has become more precious than gold, a liquid treasure that men kill for without hesitation. The scarcity of gasoline turns every drop into currency, every tank into a target. Along these lawless roads, the main force patrol, the MFP, still attempts to maintain some semblance of order, their pursuit vehicles screaming down highways in desperate chases against the chaos. But the darkness is winning. Lawless biker gangs terrorize these roads, leather-clad marauders who recognize no authority, no law, only their own savage code of violence and plunder. Among the MFP officers rides Max Rockatansky, a skilled pursuit driver whose black Ford Falcon Interceptor has become legendary on these roads. The Interceptor is a beast of machinery, a powerful V8 engine with a supercharger that whines like a banshee, creating a vehicle that's less a car and more a weapon on wheels. Max and his partner Jim Goose patrol the highways, witnessing extreme violence daily, watching their world spiral further into madness with each shift. The weight of this brutality presses down on Max's soul, and he begins to consider walking away, leaving the badge and the blood behind. But fate has other plans. The roads bring Max face to face with Toe Cutter's gang, psychotic outlaws who wear leather, chains, and bizarre punk-style outfits, riding motorcycles and modified vehicles like horsemen of an apocalypse. They terrorize innocent people without mercy, their violence theatrical and cruel, leaving devastation in their wake. Now let your mind shift across time and space to another world entirely, a typical small American town in 1958, where white picket fences line quiet streets and everyone knows their neighbors' names. This is a place of innocence, of main streets with movie theaters showing the latest features, of local diners where teenagers gather over milkshakes and jukeboxes. The surrounding countryside is peaceful, woods and rural roads where families take Sunday drives. It's the heart of 1950s suburban America, wholesome and safe. But on this particular night, something falls from the stars. A meteor streaks across the peaceful sky and crashes into the woods outside town, carrying with it something that should never have touched our world. Inside that cooling space rock lies the blob, a gelatinous alien organism, crimson and glistening, amorphous and constantly shifting shape. This creature is like nothing Earth has ever known, semi-transparent. It moves by oozing and rolling across surfaces, squeezing through any opening, driven by an endless, mindless hunger. The blob absorbs living tissue on contact, its acidic surface dissolving flesh, and with each victim it consumes, it grows larger, more terrible, more unstoppable. An old man discovers the meteor in the darkness of the forest. Curious, he approaches the strange object and pokes it with a stick. The meteor cracks open like an egg, and in an instant, the blob attacks, latching onto his hand, beginning to consume his arm. The old man's screams pierce the quiet night as the creature spreads across his flesh, absorbing, growing, hungry for more. This is how the terror begins in both worlds, with violence erupting into spaces that once felt safe, transforming ordinary places into landscapes of nightmare, where the rules of civilization no longer apply and survival becomes the only law that matters. Part 2, When Worlds Collapse. Let me tell you a story about two different kinds of endings, one that comes with fire and leather on endless roads, and another that falls from the stars in silence. Close your eyes and drift with me into these worlds. Picture first the sun-scorched highways of Australia, sometime in the near future, though it feels like it could be tomorrow. This is a world balanced on a knife's edge, a dystopian landscape where society is breaking down, crumbling like old asphalt under the relentless heat. The civilization you see here exists in its final days before total collapse. Everyone can feel it coming, like a storm on the horizon that never quite arrives but grows darker by the hour. Across this dying land stretch desolate highways, endless ribbons of cracked pavement cutting through barren, dusty outback roads that seem to lead nowhere and everywhere at once. Small isolated towns, the wasteland-like islands in an ocean of dust, each one a fragile bubble of order in an increasingly chaotic world. And on these roads, the main force patrol still tries to maintain some semblance of law, their officers racing along the highways in powerful pursuit vehicles, though everyone knows they're fighting a losing battle. But the real power on these roads belongs to the lawless biker gangs who terrorize the highways like modern-day pirates. They ride in packs, engines roaring, wearing leather, chains, and bizarre punk-style outfits that make them look like warriors from some savage future tribe. These gangs assault, rob, and murder without consequence, because consequence has lost all meaning in a world where fuel has become more precious than gold itself. The scarcity of gasoline has turned every drop into something worth killing for, and these roads have become rivers of blood. Into this nightmare rides a man named Max Rokotansky. Max is a pursuit officer, one of the best, and he's married to a woman named Jessie, a small anchor of normalcy in his increasingly violent life. But Max is changing. He witnesses extreme violence daily, and each shift on these roads chips away another piece of his humanity. He's becoming disillusioned with his dangerous job, questioning whether there's any point in trying to hold back the tide of chaos. Some nights, driving home, he considers just walking away from it all. But before Max can make that choice, the roads make it for him. His family, Jessie and their lives together, become caught in the grinding gears of this collapsing world, and when violence finally touches what he loves most, Max transforms into something darker than the criminals he once hunted. He becomes a force of pure vengeance, methodical and merciless. Now let your mind drift across space and time to somewhere completely different, a small American town in 1958, where the streets are clean and the biggest worry is whether the local movie theater will show a double feature on Saturday night. This is a typical suburban community where everyone knows everyone, where teenagers hang out at the local diner, sharing sodas and stories. The surrounding area is peaceful, woods and rural roads where families take evening walks, where kids play until the streetlights come on. On this particular night, the sky tears open. A meteor streaks down through the darkness and crashes into the woods outside town, and inside that fallen star is something that will change everything. The Blob, that's what it will be called, though that simple name can't capture the horror of what it truly is. This creature is a gelatinous alien organism, red and glistening like a wound in reality itself. It's amorphous, constantly shifting shape, semi-transparent so you can almost see through its crimson mass to the darkness within. The Blob moves by oozing and rolling, squeezing through any opening, and it hungers. It absorbs living tissue on contact, its acidic surface dissolving flesh, and with each victim it consumes, it grows larger. There's an intelligence to its hunger, or perhaps just an instinct so pure it feels like malevolence. And here's the terrible truth that will seal the town's fate: nothing can cut it, nothing can burn it, nothing can destroy it. Every weapon humanity might use is useless against this thing that fell from the stars. In the woods, an old man discovers the meteor, still smoking in the crater it made. Curious, driven by that very human need to touch and understand, he approaches and pokes it with a stick. The meteor cracks open, and in that instant, the Blob launches itself onto his hand. The creature begins consuming his arm, spreading across his flesh like living acid, and the old man's screams echo through the forest, the first sound of terror in what will become a symphony of horror. Part 3, The Wasteland Meteor. Let me tell you a story about the day the sky fell on the wasteland, and how everything that was already broken shattered completely. Picture a world teetering on the edge, a dystopian near-future Australia where society is breaking down like rust eating through metal. This is a civilization in its final days before total collapse, and everyone can feel it in their bones. Across this dying land stretch desolate highways, endless ribbons of cracked pavement cutting through barren, dusty outback roads. Small isolated towns, the wasteland like forgotten memories, each one clinging to existence by its fingernails. In this world, fuel has become more precious than life itself. The scarcity of gasoline has turned every drop into liquid gold, and men kill for it without hesitation. The Main Force Patrol, the MFP, still tries to police these highways, their officers racing along in powerful pursuit vehicles, but the lawless biker gangs are winning. These marauders terrorize the roads wearing leather, chains, and bizarre punk-style outfits, assaulting and murdering without consequence because consequence has lost all meaning. Among the MFP officers is Max Rokotansky, a skilled pursuit driver who's seen too much. Max is married to Jessie, and that connection to something normal, something human, is the only thing keeping him tethered to who he used to be. But Max witnesses extreme violence daily on these roads, and he's becoming disillusioned with his dangerous job. Some nights he thinks about walking away, leaving the badge and the blood behind. Then the meteor came. It streaked across the Australian sky one burning afternoon, a crimson streak that crashed into the woods outside one of those small isolated towns. The MFP got reports of the impact, and Max and his partner Jim Goose were dispatched to investigate. What they found in those dusty woods was a crater still smoking with the heat of space, and inside it, something that shouldn't exist. The meteor had cracked open, and oozing from it was a gelatinous alien organism, a mass of red, shifting flesh that seemed to pulse with hunger. It was amorphous, constantly changing shape, semi-transparent enough that you could see darkness swirling inside it. The thing moved. By oozing and rolling across the scorched earth, and when Goose got too close, curious like humans always are, it struck. The blob, because that's what Max would later call it in his reports, though no word could capture what it truly was, absorbed living tissue on contact. Its acidic surface began dissolving Goose's hand, spreading up his arm, and the creature grew larger as it consumed him. Max tried everything, his service weapon, fire from the interceptor's emergency flare, even trying to cut it away with a knife, but nothing could stop it. Nothing could cut it, burn it, or destroy it. The blob squeezed through Goose's fingers as he tried to pull away, moving with terrible purpose, and Max could only watch as his partner was consumed entirely, the creature swelling with each moment, hungrier and larger. Max fled back to his black Ford Falcon Interceptor, that powerful V8 beast with its supercharger, and radioed for help. But when he described what he'd seen, the response was silence, then dismissal. In a world already drowning in chaos, who would believe in a monster from space? The MFP had enough problems with the gangs terrorizing innocent people without chasing fairy tales about alien blobs. But Max knew what he'd seen. And as he drove those empty highways back toward town, passing through the barren landscape dotted with those small, isolated settlements, he realized something terrible. This thing, this blob, was heading toward civilization. It would ooze along those desolate roads, squeezing through any opening, absorbing everything living in its path. And in a world where society was already breaking down, where fuel scarcity had turned people into animals, where lawless gangs already made the highways into killing fields, what chance did anyone have against something truly unstoppable? Part 4, The Hunt begins. Max drove through the gathering dusk, his interceptor's engine rumbling like distant thunder as the supercharger whined with each acceleration. The main street of the nearest town appeared ahead, one of those typical suburban-style communities that had somehow survived in the wasteland, complete with a movie theater and a local diner where people still pretended life was normal. But Max knew normal had died the moment that meteor split open. He pulled up to the diner, where teenagers gathered despite everything falling apart around them. In this world, people clung to routines like lifelines, acting as if milkshakes and music could hold back the darkness. Max burst through the door, trying to explain what he'd seen, trying to warn them about the creature oozing its way toward town. But his words fell on deaf ears. The townsfolk looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Here was an MFP officer, someone who'd witnessed extreme violence daily on those highways, now talking about alien monsters. "Officer, we've got enough problems with Toe-Cutter's gang," the diner owner said, wiping down the counter. "Just last week they hit the fuel depot on Route 9. We don't need ghost stories about space creatures." Max felt the frustration building in his chest. He was becoming disillusioned not just with his dangerous job, but with people's refusal to see what was right in front of them. Meanwhile, somewhere in the woods beyond town, the blob was growing. With each victim it consumed, it swelled larger, an ever-expanding mass of alien hunger rolling through the Australian bush. The sun set, and Max made his way back to Jessie. She was waiting at their small house on the outskirts, one of those fragile islands of domesticity in the wasteland. When he told her what happened to Goose, her face went pale. She'd always known the roads would take him eventually, either the gangs or the crashes or the sheer weight of violence would break him. But this was something else entirely. "We need to leave," Max said. "Take a vacation, get away from here. Away from the highways, away from everything." So they packed up and headed out the next morning, driving those desolate highways that stretched endlessly through the barren landscape. Max thought distance might save them, that maybe they could outrun both the collapse of civilization and whatever that thing was in the woods. They passed through small isolated towns, each one a little more desperate than the last, fuel prices scrawled on handwritten signs, armed guards watching the pumps. But the blob wasn't confined to the woods anymore. It had found the roads. In one of those small towns they passed through, a place with a main street and a few scattered buildings, Max saw the aftermath. The local diner stood empty, its door hanging open. Inside, tables were overturned, and there on the floor were patches of dissolved matter, acidic burns eaten through the linoleum. The creature had been here. It could squeeze through any opening, under doors, through windows, down ventilation shafts. No barrier could stop it. "Max, what is that?" Jessie whispered, pointing to the street. There, oozing between two buildings, was a mass of crimson gelatinous matter, larger than a car now, moving with terrible purpose. It was semi-transparent in the fading light, and Max could see shapes inside it, shapes that had once been people. The blob absorbed living tissue on contact, dissolving flesh instantly, and it made no sound as it rolled forward, just the wet slide of its mass against the pavement. Max gunned the interceptor's engine, and they fled. But as they raced along those empty highways, Max realized something that made his blood run cold. In a world where lawless biker gangs terrorized the roads, where people killed for fuel, where society was in its final days before total collapse, this creature had found paradise. This was a world already reduced to scattered, isolated communities with no way to coordinate, no way to mount a defense. The blob could move from town to town along these desolate roads, consuming everything, growing endlessly larger, and by the time anyone believed it existed, it would be unstoppable. Behind them, in the town they just fled, the creature engulfed the movie theater, oozing through the vents and doorways. Anyone still inside, those few souls still pretending the world wasn't ending, became fuel for its growth. The blob's appetite was infinite, and in this wasteland where everything was already dying, it had found a feast that would never end. Max gripped the steering wheel tighter, his interceptor screaming down the highway. Somewhere ahead was safety, he told himself. Somewhere there had to be a place this nightmare hadn't reached. But in his heart, watching the barren, dusty outback road stretch endlessly before him, he knew the truth: there was nowhere left to run. Part 5, The Convergence. The interceptor's tires screamed as Max pushed the vehicle harder, the powerful V8 engine roaring through the night. Jessie sat silent beside him, clutching the dashboard as they navigated the winding rural roads that cut through the surrounding countryside. These roads had once been peaceful, places where families took Sunday drives, where the worst thing you might encounter was a kangaroo crossing. Now they were arteries pumping poison through a dying body. Max's mind raced faster than his car. The creature was amorphous, constantly shifting shape, which meant it could adapt to any terrain, any obstacle. On these highways where the main force patrol struggled to maintain even a pretense of order, how could anyone stop something that couldn't be killed? The MFP had vehicles and weapons designed for human threats, gangs on motorcycles, criminals in stolen cars. But this? As dawn broke across the wasteland, they approached another small isolated town. Max slowed the interceptor, scanning for any sign of the blob. The main street was eerily quiet, the storefronts dark. Then he saw them, Toe Cutter's gang, their motorcycles lined up outside what looked like an old community hall. The bikers wore their signature leather, chains, and bizarre punk-style outfits, and they were arguing loudly, clearly spooked about something. Max pulled over, keeping his distance. Toe Cutter himself stood on the hood of a wrecked car, gesturing wildly. "I'm telling you, there's something in the woods. Johnny saw it consume 3 of our boys whole. It's not human, not animal, it's like living acid." For the first time in his career, Max found himself agreeing with the criminals he'd spent years hunting. The gang had encountered the blob too, and even these men who terrorized innocent people without mercy, who lived by violence and chaos, were terrified. Some of them wanted to flee deeper into the wasteland. Others wanted to mount an attack. "You can't fight it," Max called out, stepping from his vehicle. The gang turned, hands moving to weapons. Toe Cutter's eyes narrowed when he recognized the MFP officer. Well, the great Max Rokitansky. Come to arrest us for disturbing the peace?" His voice dripped with mockery, but there was genuine fear underneath it. "That thing doesn't care about your gang or my badge," Max said. "It doesn't care about anything except feeding. And every person it takes makes it bigger." Before Toe Cutter could respond, someone screamed. At the end of the main street, the blob appeared, rolling between buildings. It had grown massive, easily the size of a truck now, maybe larger. Its red, gelatinous surface glistened in the morning light, semi-transparent enough that you could see partially dissolved bodies churning inside its mass. The creature moved by oozing and rolling forward with inexorable purpose. The gang scattered, engines roaring to life. Some bikers tried to flee down the highway, but the blob was faster than it looked. It squeezed through the narrow gap between 2 buildings with impossible speed, cutting off their escape. When one biker's motorcycle stalled, the blob rolled over him. The man's screams lasted only seconds as the creature absorbed his living tissue on contact, his body dissolving into the crimson mass. "Get in!" Max shouted to anyone who would listen. Several gang members abandoned their bikes and dove into the back of the interceptor. Even Toe Cutter, swallowing his pride, jumped onto the hood as Max floored the accelerator. They raced out of town, the blob pursuing them down the desolate highway. In the rearview mirror, Max watched it roll with terrible speed, leaving a glistening acidic trail on the asphalt. The thing could squeeze through any opening, which meant it could probably flatten itself enough to move incredibly fast when it wanted to. "Where are we going?" Jessie asked, her voice tight with fear. "Anywhere with cold," Max said. He'd been thinking about it all night. The creature came from space, from a meteor. Space was cold, maybe extreme cold was the answer. But where do you find freezing temperatures in the Australian outback? Toe Cutter, still gripping the interceptor's hood, shouted through the windshield, "There's an old meat processing plant, 50 kilometers north. They've got industrial freezers, ran on generators before the fuel shortage shut it down. It was their only chance." Max cranked the wheel, taking a side road that cut through the barren, dusty landscape. The blob followed, relentless, growing larger with each small creature or unlucky traveler it encountered along the way. Behind them, the thing left a trail of destruction across the wasteland, consuming everything living in its path. As they drove, Max realized the horrible symmetry of it all. This world was already in its final days before total collapse, infrastructure failing, society fragmenting, fuel so scarce it had turned neighbor against neighbor. The blob hadn't invaded a thriving civilization. It had found a world already bleeding out, already dying. And now it would feed on the corpse until nothing remained. Part 6, Cold Truth. The meat processing plant loomed ahead like a monument to a dead world. Its corrugated metal walls were streaked with rust, and the chain-link fence surrounding it had long since been torn down, probably salvaged for scrap or stolen by one of the lawless biker gangs that controlled the trade routes. Max brought the interceptor to a sliding stop in the gravel parking lot, and everyone piled out. The generators are probably dry, Toe Cutter said, surveying the building. Nothing runs without fuel anymore. Not in this world. But Max was already moving, his MFP training kicking in despite the surreal circumstances. He'd witnessed extreme violence daily on these highways, bodies burned, crushed, torn apart, but nothing had prepared him for this. Still, violence was violence, and every threat had a weakness. He just had to find it. Inside, the plant was a maze of stainless steel tables and hanging hooks, everything coated in years of dust. The industrial freezers stood at the back, massive walk-in units with heavy doors. Max checked the generator room. As Toe Cutter predicted, the tanks were empty. But there were compressed gas canisters lined against one wall, probably CO2 used for flash freezing meat back when this place was operational. "Jesse, help me move these," Max said, but she was standing at the loading dock door, staring out at the highway. The blob was visible in the distance, a massive crimson mass rolling across the desolate road, leaving a trail of dissolved matter behind it. It had consumed so many victims now that it had grown to the size of a small house, constantly shifting shape as it moved. The gelatinous alien organisms seemed to sense them somehow, drawn by the heat of living bodies or perhaps just following the interceptor's tire tracks. "Max, it's coming," Jesse whispered. They had maybe 10 minutes. Max and 2 of the gang members hauled the CO2 canisters to the loading dock while Toe Cutter rigged a makeshift valve system using tools from the plant's maintenance shop. It was desperate, improvised, exactly the kind of solution you came up with when society was breaking down and there was no one to call for help. "This is insane," one of the bikers muttered, a young kid who wore leather and chains but looked terrified. "We should run." "Keep running." "There's nowhere to run to," Max said flatly. "Those small isolated towns dotting the wasteland? It'll hit every single one, growing larger each time. Eventually it'll be too big to outrun." The blob reached the parking lot, oozing across the gravel. Up close, its semi-transparent surface revealed the horror within, shapes and fragments of the people it had absorbed, churning in that acidic mass. The creature rolled forward, squeezing under the loading dock door before anyone could seal it, moving with that terrible purpose that suggested something more than mindless hunger. "Now!" Max shouted. Toe Cutter opened the valves, and CO2 gas blasted from the canisters in billowing white clouds. The temperature in the loading dock plummeted. The blob's movement slowed immediately, its amorphous form beginning to solidify. The creature tried to ooze forward, to squeeze through gaps in the freezing air, but its gelatinous surface was hardening, crystallizing. "It's working!" Jesse cried. But they didn't have enough gas. The canisters were sputtering, nearly empty, and the blob was only partially frozen. Max could see the center of its mass still churning, still alive, still hungry. It couldn't be destroyed, he knew that now with certainty, but it could be stopped. "Contained." "The freezer units," Max said. "Help me." Working together, this unlikely alliance of MFP officers and the very gang members who had terrorized innocent people on these highways managed to push and pull the partially frozen blob toward one of the industrial freezers. It was like wrestling with something between solid and liquid, and the creature's acidic surface burned through their gloves, dissolving flesh where it touched skin. One of the bikers screamed as the blob absorbed his hand on contact before they managed to shove the creature fully inside the freezer. Max slammed the heavy door shut and wedged it with a steel beam. Through the small window, he could see the blob pressing against the glass, still moving sluggishly even in the sub-zero temperature. But it was contained. For now. "What do we do with it?" Toe Cutter asked, holding his burned arm. Max looked out at the barren, dusty outback stretching to the horizon, at the desolate highways cutting through a world already dying. The main force patrol couldn't handle this. The government, if there even was one anymore, couldn't handle this. In a civilization in its final days before total collapse, there was no infrastructure for dealing with alien threats. "We take it north," Max said finally. "As far north as we can, to the coldest place left. Maybe Antarctica if we can find a ship with fuel. Somewhere it can stay frozen forever." Jesse touched his arm. "Max, we don't even have enough fuel to get out of this district. You know that." She was right. The scarcity of gasoline had made long-distance travel nearly impossible. They were trapped here, in this wasteland, with a frozen alien monster that would thaw the moment power failed or the temperature rose. And in the Australian outback, temperatures always rose. Max looked at the interceptor outside, at its powerful V8 engine with the supercharger. He'd become disillusioned with his dangerous job, questioned whether any of this fighting mattered when the world was ending anyway. But maybe this was what it had all been for, not to stop human criminals, but to be here, now, with the skills and the will to contain something far worse. "Then we guard it," Max said quietly. "For as long as we can." Part 7, The Price of Survival. The next 3 days passed in an uneasy truce. Max, Jesse, Toe Cutter, and what remained of his gang camped in the meat processing plant, taking shifts watching the freezer. The blob pressed constantly against the window, its red mass pulsing slowly even in the cold, reminding them all that it was merely contained, not defeated. Nothing could cut, burn, or destroy it, that much they'd learned. The only thing keeping it from consuming them all was a few inches of insulated metal and whatever cold they could maintain. Max stood watch on the 4th night when he heard engines in the distance. His hand moved instinctively to his service weapon. Even now, even with an alien horror frozen 20 feet away, the human threats hadn't disappeared. If anything, they'd gotten worse. Word had spread through the wasteland that Toe Cutter's gang was holed up here, and other gangs saw opportunity. They came at dawn, another biker gang on motorcycles and modified vehicles, wearing their own collection of leather and chains and bizarre punk-style outfits, like some kind of post-apocalyptic uniform. They wanted Toe Cutter's territory, his fuel caches, his weapons. They didn't believe the stories about an alien creature. In a world where society was breaking down and fuel was more precious than life, monsters from space seemed like convenient lies. "There's nothing here worth dying for," Max called out from the loading dock. "Turn around." Their leader, a scarred man on a Kawasaki motorcycle, laughed. "That's not how this works, officer. This is how it goes now, we take, you give, or everyone dies." The gang opened fire, bullets sparking off metal. Max and the others returned fire from cover, and for a few minutes it was just like every other highway battle Max had fought over the years: violence, chaos, the smell of gunpowder and burning fuel. But then one of the attacking bikers threw something through a broken window. A Molotov cocktail. The flames spread across the plant floor, igniting oil stains and old wooden pallets. The temperature inside began to rise immediately. Max's heart sank as he looked toward the freezer room. They'd been running the CO2 system on a careful schedule to conserve the remaining gas, but with fire spreading through the building, the ambient temperature would climb fast. "The blob!" Jesse shouted. Through the freezer window, they could see it beginning to move more actively, the edges of its gelatinous form softening, starting to ooze again. The creature was thawing. "Fall back!" Toe Cutter yelled to his men. "Everyone out!" But the attacking gang had them surrounded, and the fire was spreading. Max made a split-second decision. He ran to the generator room and hauled out the remaining CO2 canisters, rolling them toward the freezer. If the blob got out now, with 2 gangs and Jesse all trapped in this building, it would consume everyone. It would grow larger than ever, completely unstoppable. An explosion rocked the building as fuel tanks ignited. Max was thrown against a wall, his vision blurring. When he looked up, he saw the freezer door had buckled from the blast. The blob was oozing through the gap, its amorphous body squeezing through any opening, just as it always did. The attacking gang members saw it and their bravado evaporated. The creature rolled toward them with terrible speed, and their screams filled the plant as it absorbed living tissue on contact, dissolving flesh within seconds. The blob grew larger with each victim it consumed, swelling like some nightmare made manifest. "Run!" Max grabbed Jesse's hand and they sprinted for the interceptor. Behind them, the plant had become an inferno, and the blob was in the middle of it all, feeding, growing, unstoppable. Some of Toe Cutter's gang made it to their motorcycles. Others weren't so lucky. Max gunned the Interceptor's engine, and they tore out of the parking lot onto the desolate highway. In the rearview mirror, he watched the meat processing plant collapse in flames, and rolling out of the wreckage came the blob, larger now than a building, its semi-transparent crimson mass reflecting the firelight as it moved across the barren landscape. "Where do we go?" Jessie asked, her voice breaking. "Max, where can we possibly go?" He didn't have an answer. They were running low on fuel, the gauge showed less than a quarter tank, and in this world where the scarcity of gasoline made every drop precious, that meant maybe 100 kilometers if they were lucky. The main force patrol was scattered, probably dissolved entirely by now. The small isolated towns dotting the wasteland would fall one by one to that thing. There was no government response coming, no military, no salvation. Max drove in silence, the powerful V8 engine humming beneath them, the supercharger whining as they pushed faster down the empty highway. This was the world now, desolate highways stretching through barren, dusty outback roads, with an alien horror rolling somewhere behind them, consuming everything in its path. Toe Cutter pulled up alongside them on his motorcycle, shouting over the wind. "There's one place. An old research station in the deep outback. They had cryogenic equipment for storing biological samples. If we can get there before it does, maybe." A gunshot rang out. One of the attacking gang members who'd survived was pursuing them, firing wildly. The bullet struck Toe Cutter's fuel tank, and the motorcycle erupted in flames. The gang leader went down in a tumbling crash of leather, chains, and burning metal, disappearing in the Interceptor's dust. Max didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He just kept driving, watching the fuel gauge drop, knowing that somewhere behind them the blob was rolling along these same roads, growing larger, consuming this dying world one victim at a time. And the horrible truth settled over him like ash, in a civilization already in its final days before total collapse, maybe the blob wasn't an invasion at all. Maybe it was just the final page in a story that was already ending. Part 8. Into the deep outback. The research station materialized out of the heat shimmer like a mirage, a cluster of prefabricated buildings surrounded by solar panels and rusted chain-link fencing. Max eased the Interceptor to a stop, the engine ticking as it cooled. The fuel gauge needle hovered just above empty. They'd made it, but only barely, and there would be no driving out of here. This was the end of the road. Jessie climbed out, shielding her eyes against the brutal sun. Around them stretched nothing but barren, dusty outback roads disappearing into emptiness. This was one of the most remote small isolated towns in the wasteland, if you could even call a research station a town. It had been built decades ago to study extremophile bacteria or some such thing, back when governments still funded science, back before fuel scarcity turned the world into a savage scramble for survival. "Anyone home?" Jessie called out, but her voice was swallowed by the vast silence. Max approached the main building cautiously. The door hung open, creaking in the hot wind. Inside, the facility was abandoned but largely intact, desks covered in dust, papers scattered across floors, coffee mugs sitting where they'd been left years ago when the staff realized no one was coming to relieve them, that the world outside had moved on to more immediate concerns like staying alive. But the cryogenic storage was still there, humming quietly. Somehow, impossibly, the solar panels were still providing enough power to keep the system running. Max found the control panel, banks of freezer units designed to keep biological samples at temperatures far below zero. "This could work," he said, running his hand over the controls. "If we can lure it here, trap it in one of these units." "And then what?" Jessie interrupted, her voice sharp with exhaustion and fear. "Max, even if we trap it, even if we freeze it solid, what then? We're in the middle of nowhere. The main force patrol doesn't exist anymore. There's no one to call, no one coming to help. We're just delaying the inevitable." She was right, and Max knew it. He'd witnessed extreme violence daily for years, had become disillusioned with his dangerous job precisely because he'd seen how futile it all was. You couldn't stop the collapse. You couldn't save a world that was already dying. But maybe you could buy time. Maybe you could save a few more days, a few more lives. Then we delay it, Max said quietly. That's all we've ever done. They spent the next hours preparing. Max found flare guns and the emergency supplies and set them up around the perimeter. Jesse discovered that the research station had been studying extremophile organisms, creatures that lived in extreme conditions. The irony wasn't lost on her, humanity studying life that survived in hostile environments, only to be invaded by something even more extreme, something that made extreme conditions irrelevant because it simply absorbed and grew. As night fell, they saw it on the horizon. The blob, now grotesquely large, rolled across the desolate highway like a crimson sunset made solid. It had consumed so much, entire gang camps, scattered survivors, anyone unlucky enough to be traveling these roads. The creature had grown to the size of a small building, maybe larger, its amorphous form constantly shifting and reshaping itself as it moved. Through binoculars, Max could see the true horror of it, the semi-transparent surface revealing countless shapes churning inside, all the people and animals it had absorbed, their forms partially visible like specimens in some nightmarish display. The blob absorbed living tissue on contact, and every victim became part of its mass, fuel for its endless growth. It knows we're here, Jesse said. How does it know? Heat, maybe, Max suggested. Or it can sense movement. Doesn't matter. It's coming. They retreated into the research station and sealed what doors they could, though they both knew it wouldn't matter. The creature could squeeze through any opening, under doors, through ventilation ducts, down drains. No barrier could stop something without a fixed form, something that moved by oozing and rolling and reshaping itself to fit any space. The blob reached the perimeter fence and simply flowed over it like water, except water didn't dissolve the metal posts on contact, didn't leave acidic scorch marks on everything it touched. It approached the main building, and Max lit the flares. The creature paused, its surface rippling, as if considering this new obstacle. Then it simply went around, flowing toward the rear entrance. Now! Max shouted. They triggered the emergency sprinkler system they'd rigged earlier, but instead of water, CO2 gas flooded the corridor. The temperature plummeted, and the blob's movement slowed immediately. Its gelatinous form began to harden, ice crystals forming across its surface. But they'd learned from the meat processing plant, the creature couldn't be destroyed, only contained, and even that was temporary. Working quickly, they used pneumatic dollies to push the semi-frozen mass toward the largest cryogenic chamber. The blob fought them, portions of it still liquid enough to grab at their legs, to burn through their protective clothing. Max felt the acidic touch on his arm and gritted his teeth against the pain as skin dissolved. With a final heave, they got it inside and slammed the chamber door. Max punched the controls, and the temperature inside dropped to minus 196 degrees Celsius. Through the reinforced window, they watched the blob freeze completely solid, a crimson sculpture of cosmic horror preserved in ice. For a long moment, they just stood there, breathing hard, staring at the thing that had chased them across the wasteland. Then Jessie started laughing, a harsh, slightly hysterical sound. "We did it," she said. "We actually did it." But Max was looking at the solar panels outside, calculating in his head. How long would they last? How long before dust covered them, before components failed, before the power flickered and died? And when that happened, when the temperature rose, the blob would thaw. It would ooze out of this chamber and continue its feast across a world that had no defense against it. Outside, the Australian night settled over the barren landscape, stars emerging in the vast darkness. Somewhere out there, on those desolate highways, the lawless biker gangs still rode. The main force patrol still tried to maintain order in a society experiencing its final days before total collapse. Life, such as it was, continued in the wasteland. And here, in this forgotten research station in the deep outback, two people stood guard over a frozen nightmare, knowing that they'd only bought time, not victory, not salvation, just time. Part 9, The Long Watch. Days turned into weeks at the research station, and Max and Jessie fell into a rhythm of survival. Each morning, Max would check the cryogenic chamber, peering through the reinforced window at the frozen blob inside. The creature remained solid, its red gelatinous surface locked in crystalline stasis, but he could swear it was watching him somehow, waiting with alien patience for the inevitable moment when the power would fail. Jesse had taken to monitoring the radio, scanning through frequencies on the research station's equipment. Most channels were dead static, but occasionally voices would crackle through, survivors in other small isolated towns dotting the wasteland, asking if anyone was out there, reporting on gang activity, begging for fuel. The world was still dying, still tearing itself apart, just more slowly now. One transmission caught Max's attention. It was from a main force patrol officer he'd known, broadcasting from a station 200 kilometers south. "This is MFP Station 7. Society is breaking down faster than we anticipated. The gangs have taken the fuel depot at Silverton. We're abandoning our post. This will be our last transmission. To anyone listening, good luck out there." Max turned off the radio. There was nothing to say to that. The MFP was finished, had probably been finished for months now. He thought about his interceptor sitting outside, that beautiful black machine with its powerful V8 engine and supercharger, now nothing more than a monument to a world that no longer existed. Without fuel, it was just sculpture. "Max," Jesse called from the window. "We have company." A convoy was approaching along the desolate highway, 3 vehicles and several motorcycles kicking up dust trails. As they got closer, Max recognized the style, another gang, wearing their signature leather, chains, and bizarre punk-style outfits. But these ones were flying a white flag from one of the bikes. The convoy stopped at the perimeter, and a woman dismounted. She was older than most gang members Max had encountered, her face weathered by years on the roads. She approached with her hands visible, unthreatening. "We heard about what you've got in there," she called out. "The thing from space. We've been running from it for weeks, thought it had finally caught up to us. Is it true you stopped it?" Max stepped outside, his hand near his weapon but not on it. "It's contained. For now." The woman nodded slowly. "For now. That's all anyone can promise anymore, isn't it?" She gestured to her people. "We were part of the terror on these highways once. We assaulted, robbed, murdered without consequence because that's what you did to survive. But that thing..." She shook her head. "It made us realize there are worse things than humans killing humans." "What do you want?" Max asked. "To help," she said simply. "We've got fuel, not much, but some. Enough to keep your generators running if the solar fails. We've got people who can stand watch, give you and your woman some rest. In return..." She looked back at her gang. "In return, we get to know it's contained. That it's not out there consuming everything. That maybe, just maybe, we bought ourselves a little more time before the end." It was a strange alliance, MFP officer and outlaws, working together to guard a frozen alien horror. But these were strange times, and Max had learned that survival required flexibility. He agreed, and the gang set up camp around the research station. Over the following weeks, more arrived. Survivors from those small isolated towns, refugees fleeing along the barren, dusty outback roads, people who'd heard rumors of a place where someone had actually stopped the creature from the stars. They came in ones and twos, in families and small groups, until nearly 30 people were camped around the facility. They formed a community of sorts, though everyone knew it was temporary. The blob pressed against its chamber window, a constant reminder that nothing could cut, burn, or destroy it, only delay it. The creature was amorphous, could squeeze through any opening when thawed, and would eventually break free. It was just a matter of time. Max found himself thinking about Jessie more often during those quiet nights. She was his anchor, the reason he'd kept fighting when everything else fell apart. Watching her organize the survivors, distribute the meager resources, create some semblance of structure in the chaos, it reminded him of who he'd been before the roads had hardened him, before he'd witnessed so much extreme violence that he'd become disillusioned with everything. But the wasteland always collected its debts. One scorching afternoon, a scout came racing back on a motorcycle, his face pale with fear. "There's another one," he gasped. Another meteor. Crashed about 50 kilometers east. The crater's still smoking. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Max felt something break inside him, some last reserve of hope he hadn't known he was holding on to. If there were more meteors, more blobs, then containing this one meant nothing. The creatures would keep coming, keep consuming, until the entire world was dissolved into their ever-growing masses. How many? Jessie asked, her voice steady despite everything. Don't know, the scout said. Couldn't get close. But if it's like the first one. Max looked at the research station, at the frozen blob inside, at the community of survivors who'd gathered here believing they'd found safety. He thought about the desolate highways stretching endlessly through the wasteland, about the civilization in its final days before total collapse, about fuel so scarce that even running from these creatures was becoming impossible. We can't stop them all, he said quietly. No, Jessie agreed, taking his hand. But maybe we can slow them down. Buy time for someone, somewhere, to figure out a real solution. That's all we've ever been able to do, Max, buy time. The sun was setting over the barren landscape, painting the outback in shades of red that reminded Max uncomfortably of the blob's coloring. Somewhere out there, another creature was beginning its feast. And somewhere beyond that, perhaps more meteors were falling, more alien horrors were landing on this dying world. But here, in this forgotten research station, 30-odd survivors stood together against the darkness. It wasn't victory. It wasn't even hope, really. It was just stubbornness, the human refusal to go quietly into extinction, even when extinction seemed inevitable. Max looked at the interceptor one last time, remembering the feeling of that powerful engine beneath him, the freedom of the open road. Those days were gone. Now there was only the watch, the vigil, the long slow battle against something that couldn't be defeated. And somehow, impossibly, that had to be enough. Part 10, The Second Coming. Max assembled a team at dawn, 5 volunteers willing to investigate the second meteor crash. They loaded into 2 vehicles, siphoning precious fuel from the communal reserves. Every drop of gasoline was a negotiation now, a calculation of survival versus necessity. The scarcity of fuel had made even short trips feel like expeditions into the unknown. The convoy rolled out onto the desolate highway, leaving the research station behind. Max drove the interceptor, its powerful V8 engine and supercharger roaring one last time. Beside him, Jessie checked her weapon, a futile gesture they both knew, but humans clung to rituals even when they were meaningless. The landscape they traveled through was classic wasteland, barren, dusty outback roads cutting through emptiness. They passed the burned-out husks of vehicles, the remnants of gang battles, the occasional makeshift grave marker. This was a world in its final days before total collapse, and every mile of highway told that story in rust and bone. There, one of the scouts radioed from the lead vehicle, pointing ahead. The second crash site was worse than Max had imagined. The meteor had hit harder, creating a crater the size of a house. But it wasn't the destruction that made his blood run cold, it was what he saw moving at the bottom of that crater. Not one blob, but 3 separate masses, each already the size of a car, their red gelatinous surfaces glistening in the morning sun. God help us, Jessie whispered. The blobs were spreading out from the impact site, moving by oozing and rolling across the scorched earth. They were amorphous, constantly shifting shape to navigate the terrain, and even from this distance, Max could see they were hunting. One rolled toward a cluster of dead trees where birds had been nesting. Within seconds, the tree was engulfed, and the blob emerged larger, having absorbed every living thing it touched. We can't contain 3 of them, one of the volunteers said, a former gang member who now wore fear instead of bravado. We barely managed 1. Max knew he was right. The research station had 1 functioning cryogenic chamber. Even if they could lure all 3 creatures there, which seemed impossible, they had no way to freeze them all. And these blobs were already consuming everything in their path, growing larger with each victim. Soon they'd be unstoppable. We split them up, Max said, thinking aloud. Lead them in different directions, to different containment sites. There have to be other facilities out here, old military bases, more research stations, anywhere with industrial cooling. With what fuel? Jesse countered. Max, we're running on fumes as it is. The main force patrol is gone. There's no coordination, no communication network. We're just 30 people trying to hold back an alien invasion with solar panels and hope. She was right, and Max felt the weight of that truth crushing him. He'd become disillusioned with his dangerous job years ago, questioning whether maintaining order in a dying world meant anything. Now he had his answer. It didn't matter whether you believed in the fight or not, because the fight was all there was. You kept going because stopping meant accepting the end. One of the blobs suddenly moved with shocking speed, rolling toward their position. It had sensed them somehow, heat, movement, the chemical signature of living tissue, and it was hungry. The creature could squeeze through any opening, which meant their vehicles offered no real protection. If it reached them, it would simply flow through the windows, under the doors, consuming them in seconds. Go! Go! Max shouted, gunning the interceptor's engine. They fled back along the desolate highway, but the blob pursued with terrible determination. Max watched in the rearview mirror as it rolled across the barren landscape, leaving a trail of dissolved vegetation and earth in its wake. The thing absorbed living tissue on contact, its acidic surface turning everything organic into fuel for its growth. The lead vehicle wasn't fast enough. The blob caught up, flowing over the rear bumper. The driver swerved, trying to shake it loose, but the creature was already squeezing through the back window. The screams lasted only seconds before the vehicle careened off the road and crashed. The blob oozed out of the wreckage, noticeably larger now, and continued its pursuit. Max made a decision. He cranked the wheel, turning the interceptor off the highway onto a side road that led deeper into the wasteland. We lead it away, he told Jesse. Away from the station, away from the survivors. Buy them time to evacuate. Max, we'll run out of fuel before it runs out of hunger. I know. They drove in silence after that, the interceptor eating up the road while the fuel gauge needle dropped toward empty. Behind them, the blob rolled relentlessly onward, tireless, patient, inevitable. This was the world now, not the quick violence of gangs terrorizing the highways, not the slow decay of society running out of resources, but something worse. An alien hunger that would consume everything, given time. The sun climbed higher, turning the outback into a furnace. Small isolated towns appeared and disappeared in the interceptor's dust, ghost settlements where people had once lived before the collapse, before the fuel ran out, before hope died. Max wondered if any of those towns had survivors, if the other two blobs were already rolling through their streets, absorbing their populations. Finally, inevitably, the interceptor coughed and stuttered. The fuel gauge read empty. Max coaxed the vehicle another kilometer on fumes before it died completely, rolling to a stop in the middle of nowhere. Around them stretched nothing but barren, dusty outback roads and empty horizon. Jesse took his hand. I love you, Max. I know I don't say it enough, but... I know, he said quietly. They sat in the interceptor and watched the blob approach. It was massive now, having consumed the other vehicle's occupants and probably countless other creatures along the way. Its semi-transparent red surface revealed the shapes of all its victims churning inside, human, animal, everything reduced to the same gelatinous mass. The creature reached the interceptor and began to flow over the hood. Max could see it up close now, see how it was constantly shifting shape, adapting, hunting. Nothing could cut, burn, or destroy it. This was how it ended, not in a violent crash on some highway, not burned alive by a gang, but consumed by something that shouldn't exist, on a road that led nowhere, in a world that was already dead. The blob pressed against the windshield, beginning to squeeze through the seal around the glass. And then, impossibly, they heard an engine. Part 11, The Frozen Road. The engine sound grew louder, and through the heat shimmer appeared a massive vehicle, a refrigerated transport truck, the kind that used to haul frozen goods before the collapse. It roared down the desolate highway toward them, and Max could see modifications welded to its frame, armored plating, reinforced bumpers, and what looked like industrial cooling units strapped to the roof. The truck didn't slow down. It smashed into the blob at full speed, and the impact sent the creature flying off the interceptor's hood. The gelatinous mass hit the ground and immediately began reforming, its amorphous body flowing back together, but the truck had bought them seconds. "Get in," a voice shouted from the cab. Max and Jesse scrambled out and dove into the truck's rear compartment. The driver gunned the engine and they lurched forward, leaving the blob behind. Inside the refrigerated cargo area, the temperature was barely above freezing, and Max saw why. The walls were lined with CO2 canisters, all rigged to a central release system. The driver was the woman from the gang who'd arrived at the research station weeks ago. "We figured you'd need backup," she said through the speaker system. "When the second meteor hit, some of us decided to get creative." "That thing will follow us," Jessie said, her teeth already chattering from the cold. "I'm counting on it," the woman replied. "We're heading to an old military installation, about 80 kilometers north. It's got underground bunkers with climate control systems still running on geothermal. We can trap it there." But Max was looking out the rear window at the blob, which was already rolling after them. And beyond it, he could see two more crimson masses on the horizon, the other creatures from the second meteor, converging on their location. The blobs moved by oozing and rolling with surprising speed, and they seemed to be coordinating somehow, hurting their prey. "There are 3 of them now," Max said. The woman cursed. "Then we better move fast." The truck barreled down the barren, dusty outback roads, pushing its limits. But even modified and armored, it couldn't outrun 3 alien creatures indefinitely. The fuel gauge, always the fuel gauge in this world where scarcity of gasoline ruled everything, showed half a tank. Maybe enough, maybe not. They passed through one of the small isolated towns dotting the wasteland, its main street empty except for the wind. The blobs rolled through behind them, and Max watched in horror as one of them detected survivors hiding in a building. The creature squeezed through a window, any opening was enough, and moments later emerged larger, having absorbed whoever had been inside. Living tissue dissolved on contact with that acidic surface, and every victim added to the blob's mass. "They're getting bigger," Jesse observed. "If they keep consuming, they'll be the size of buildings by the time we reach the installation." "Then we don't let them consume anything else," the driver said, and cranked the wheel hard. The truck skidded onto a side road, this one even more desolate than the main highway. There was nothing out here, no towns, no settlements, no life at all. Just empty roads cutting through wasteland under a merciless sun. The blobs followed, but without victims to consume, they couldn't grow. It was a race now. Could they reach the installation before the truck ran out of fuel? The kilometers crawled by. Max found himself thinking about the world before, when highways had traffic, when fuel stations lined the roads, when the main force patrol actually had resources to patrol with. He'd witnessed extreme violence daily in that world, had become disillusioned watching society break down, but at least then there had been something to fight for. Now they were just delaying extinction. "There," the driver called out. The military installation rose from the flat landscape like a fortress, concrete bunkers half buried in the earth, surrounded by fences that had long since been stripped for salvage. But the important part was underground, the driver explained. Geothermal vents that had powered the base's climate control for decades, systems that still functioned even after the base was abandoned. They screeched to a halt at the entrance, and everyone piled out. The blobs were perhaps a kilometer behind, 3 crimson masses rolling across the wasteland in formation. Max could see now how truly massive they'd become, each one larger than his interceptor, their semi-transparent surfaces revealing the horrific churning of partially dissolved bodies inside. "Down here," the driver said, leading them to a bunker entrance. Underground, the facility was a maze of corridors and chambers. The climate control systems hummed steadily, powered by heat from deep in the earth. They found what they needed in the lowest level, a massive freezer unit, big enough to hold all 3 blobs if they could lure them inside. "How do we get them down here?" Jesse asked. "They follow heat, movement, living things. We'd have to be bait," Max finished. "Someone has to lead them in." He looked at the others, the gang woman, the handful of survivors who'd come in the truck. They were terrified but determined, survivors in a world that no longer had room for the weak. These were people who'd once terrorized innocent people on the highways, who'd lived by violence, but the blobs had changed something fundamental. When faced with true horror, humanity's petty divisions seemed absurd. "I'll do it," Max said. "I'm MFP. Or I was. This is what I signed up for, protecting people, even if those people are reformed gang members," the woman said with a bitter smile. "Save the speech, officer. We all do what we have to do." They set up the trap carefully. The freezer unit's door was rigged to seal automatically once the blobs entered. CO2 canisters lined the corridor leading to it, ready to blast the creatures with freezing gas. And Max, Jesse, and 3 volunteers positioned themselves as bait, their body heat drawing the creatures deeper into the facility. The first blob oozed down the entrance ramp, its gelatinous form squeezing through the doorway with ease. Behind it came the other 2, moving with that terrible purpose that suggested more than mindless hunger. They were hunting, and they were close to their prey. Max ran, leading the creatures through the corridors. The blobs pursued, flowing along the walls and ceiling, constantly shifting shape to move faster. He could feel the temperature rising behind him, the heat of the creature's acidic mass burning through the air. "Now," he shouted. The volunteers triggered the CO2 system. White clouds of freezing gas flooded the corridor, and the blob's movement slowed immediately. Max and the others sprinted for the freezer chamber, the creatures oozing after them more slowly now, their surfaces beginning to crystallize. They made it inside and dove through a side exit as the 3 blobs rolled into the chamber. The automatic door slammed shut with a heavy clang, and Max punched the controls. The temperature inside the chamber plummeted to -196 degrees Celsius. Through the reinforced window, they watched the 3 blobs freeze solid, 3 crimson sculptures of cosmic horror, preserved in ice, surrounded by the shapes of all the victims they'd consumed. For a long moment, no one spoke. They just stood there, breathing hard, staring at the frozen nightmares. "How long will it hold?" Jesse finally asked. Max looked at the geothermal readouts. "Indefinitely, maybe. As long as the Earth's heat keeps powering the system." "And if more meteors fall?" the gang woman asked. No one had an answer for that. Part 12, The Last Road. They emerged from the underground bunker into the fading light of evening. The Australian sky was painted in shades of amber and crimson, colors that reminded Max uncomfortably of the blobs frozen below. The refrigerated truck sat where they'd left it, and beyond it stretched those endless desolate highways cutting through the barren, dusty outback roads that had become the arteries of a dying world. Max walked to the perimeter fence and looked out across the wasteland. Somewhere out there, in those small isolated towns dotting the landscape, people were still trying to survive. Some were probably still terrorizing others, lawless biker gangs wearing their leather, chains, and bizarre punk-style outfits, assaulting and robbing because that's what you did when civilization collapsed. Others were just trying to hold on, to find another day's worth of fuel, another meal, another reason to keep breathing. "We should head back to the research station," Jesse said, joining him. "Tell the others what we've done here. Start organizing. If more meteors fall, we need a network, a system for containment." "With what?" Max asked quietly. "We've got maybe 2 more sites like this in the entire region. No fuel to reach them, no communication to coordinate. The main force patrol is gone, Jesse. The government, if there ever was one, is finished. We're just scattered survivors pretending we can hold back the universe." She was quiet for a moment, then took his hand. "You've become disillusioned again. I can see it. Just like before, when you wanted to quit, when the violence got to be too much." "But Max," she turned him to face her. "You didn't quit then, and you can't quit now. Because if we give up, if everyone gives up, then those things win by default." The gang woman approached, overhearing. "She's right. Look, I spent years on those highways, making them unsafe, being part of the problem. My people and I, we terrorized innocent people without consequence because we thought consequences didn't exist anymore. But they do. They're just different now." She gestured toward the bunker. "Those things down there? They're the consequence of giving up, of letting entropy win. And I'm not ready for that. Not yet." Max looked at them both, then at the handful of other survivors gathered near the truck. They were watching him, waiting. He realized with a strange clarity that he'd somehow become a symbol, the MFP officer who'd faced the blob and survived, who'd contained not one but 4 alien horrors. It didn't matter that it was mostly luck and desperation. People needed symbols in the wasteland. "All right," he said finally. "We go back. We organize. We prepare for the next one." The journey back was slower. They had to conserve fuel, and the truck's systems needed frequent maintenance. They traveled the barren, dusty outback roads at a careful pace, always watching the horizon for signs of more meteors, more blobs. The landscape seemed emptier than ever, as if the world itself was holding its breath. They passed the wreckage of Max's Interceptor, that beautiful machine with its powerful V8 engine and supercharger, now just another piece of rusted metal in the wasteland. Max felt a pang looking at it. That car had been part of his identity, a symbol of the MFP, of law and order on highways that knew neither. Now it was a monument to a world that no longer existed. "We could strip it for parts," one of the volunteers suggested. "No," Max said. "Leave it. Let it rust. Some things should be remembered, even if only by their ghosts." As they drove, they picked up radio chatter, fragments of transmissions from other survivors. Most were desperate pleas for help, reports of gang violence, arguments over fuel. But a few, just a few, were different. People reporting strange meteor sightings, asking if anyone else had seen the red creatures, warning others to stay away from certain areas. Word was spreading. The blobs were becoming known, feared, but at least acknowledged. That was something. They reached the research station after dark. The community had grown, more survivors had arrived, drawn by rumors of safety, of someone who'd actually fought back against the creatures. There were maybe 50 people now, camped around the facility in makeshift shelters, rationing fuel and food, sharing stories and skills. Max briefed them on the military installation, on the 3 frozen blobs, on the system they'd used. A few of the survivors had technical backgrounds, engineers, mechanics, people who'd kept the world running before it fell apart. They immediately began planning, identifying other potential containment sites, calculating fuel requirements, organizing watch rotations. It wasn't much. It wasn't even close to enough. But it was something. Jesse found Max later that night, standing watch by the cryogenic chamber where the first blob remained frozen. The creature pressed against the window as always, its red gelatinous mass seemingly aware despite the cold, as if it could wait forever for the chance to thaw, to resume its amorphous shifting and oozing, to squeeze through any opening and continue consuming. "You're thinking about the end," she said. It wasn't a question. "Always," Max admitted. "Ever since I joined the MFP, I've been watching the world die. The fuel scarcity, the gangs, the violence, it was all leading here, to this. A civilization in its final days before total collapse. The blobs didn't cause it, Jesse. They're just the final chapter of a story that was already ending." "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe they're a new beginning. A reason for people to work together instead of tearing each other apart. I've seen former gang members and MFP officers cooperating, Jesse. I've seen people who used to terrorize highways now standing guard to protect others. The blobs are horrible, but they've reminded us of something important." "What's that?" "That there are worse things than each other." Max considered this, watching the frozen blob. Nothing could cut, burn, or destroy these creatures. They absorbed living tissue on contact, grew larger with each victim, moved by oozing and rolling through any space. They were, in every practical sense, unstoppable. Eventually, whether in days or years, they would overwhelm humanity's ability to contain them. But eventually wasn't now. And now was all anyone ever really had. "Come on," Jesse said, pulling him away from the window. "You need rest. Tomorrow we start building the network, organizing the watch, preparing for whatever comes next. Tonight, we sleep. Even in the wasteland, even at the end of the world, people need to sleep." They walked back through the facility together, past survivors settling in for the night, past the humming solar panels and fuel reserves, past all the fragile infrastructure of survival. Outside, the desolate highway stretched into darkness, and somewhere in that darkness, more meteors might be falling, more blobs might be landing, more horrors might be beginning their slow consumption of the world. But here, in this small circle of light and warmth, humanity endured. Not because they thought they could win, but because the alternative was unacceptable. They would watch, and wait, and fight, and delay the inevitable for as long as possible. And in a world where society was breaking down, where fuel was scarce and gangs ruled the roads, where alien horrors fell from the sky, that stubborn refusal to surrender might be the most human thing left. Max lay down beside Jesse in their small quarters, listening to the night sounds of the wasteland, wind across empty roads, the distant rumble of a motorcycle, the steady hum of the cryogenic systems. His eyes closed, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to hope. Not for salvation. Not for victory. Just for another day, another sunrise, another chance to stand between the darkness and the people who deserved to see morning. In the wasteland, that was enough. That had to be enough. The end, for now.